It was December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor had burned beneath the wings of his fellow aviators. The acrid smell of aviation fuel mixed with the humid tropical air as Zero fighters lined the runway like sleeping predators, their propellers gleaming in the golden light. Fuchida had led the first wave at Pearl Harbor, watching American battleships disappear beneath columns of black smoke and orange flame. Now, as he prepared for another mission over the Philippines, he carried with him the intoxicating confidence of a warrior whose enemy had been caught sleeping. The Americans, he believed, were soft, a nation of merchants and pleasure seekers who would crumble at the first taste of Japanese steel. This was the moment when the empire of the rising sun stood at its zenith, its military machine having struck with the precision of a samurai sword across the Pacific. From the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Southeast Asia, Japanese forces had achieved what many thought impossible. They had brought the mighty United States to its knees in a matter of hours. The attack on December 7th had been more than a military victory. It was validation of everything the Japanese military had believed about American weakness. In the planning rooms of Tokyo, strategists had spoken of American decadence, of a nation grown fat on peacetime prosperity, unable to match the spiritual purity and warrior discipline of the Japanese fighting man. They had studied intelligence reports describing American soldiers as undisciplined, their officers more concerned with comfort than combat effectiveness. The swift success at Pearl Harbor seemed to confirm every assumption about American military inferiority. But as Japanese pilots prepared for subsequent missions across the Pacific theater, they carried with them expectations shaped by years of propaganda and cultural conditioning. They had been taught that Americans were individualistic to a fault, lacking the collective spirit necessary for prolonged warfare. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the weakness of democratic societies, arguing that nations built on personal freedom and material comfort could never match the unified will of an empire dedicated to the emperor's divine mission. The average Japanese pilot climbing into his Zero on that December morning believed he was facing an enemy already defeated in spirit, if not yet in fact. They expected to find American forces in disarray, their morale shattered, their equipment inferior, and their resolve crumbling under the weight of Japanese superior tactics and unshakable determination. The reality they would encounter in the months and years to come would shatter these assumptions in ways that would fundamentally alter Japanese understanding of their enemy and ultimately of warfare itself. As Japanese forces advanced across the Pacific, capturing territory and taking prisoners, they would discover something that no intelligence report had prepared them for, something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about American character and capability. The first hints of this revelation would come not on the battlefield, but in the most unexpected of places, behind barbed wire, in the prison camps where captured American servicemen were held. The initial wave of American prisoners taken in the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, and other early Japanese conquests appeared to confirm Japanese expectations. Many were young men who had never seen combat, reservists and peacetime soldiers caught off guard by the sudden onslaught of war. They seemed bewildered, some clearly in shock from the speed and violence of the Japanese advance. Japanese guards and officers noted their apparent lack of martial discipline compared to Japanese standards. They talked back to authority, showed individualistic tendencies, and seemed more concerned with personal comfort than military bearing. This initial impression reinforced Japanese beliefs about American military weakness and cultural inferiority. But as weeks turned to months, something unexpected began to emerge in these camps, something that would profoundly disturb Japanese observers and challenge their fundamental assumptions about their enemy. Despite the harsh conditions, inadequate food, and brutal treatment, the American prisoners began to display qualities that Japanese military doctrine insisted they did not possess. They organized themselves into informal leadership structures that maintained discipline without the rigid hierarchy that Japanese culture deemed essential. They shared their meager rations with sick comrades, maintained morale through humor and camaraderie, and showed a resilience that seemed to defy everything Japanese strategists had predicted about American character under stress. Captain Yoshio Tsunoda, a veteran pilot who had participated in attacks on Dutch Harbor and later served as a liaison officer at several POW camps, would later write in his personal diary about his growing unease as he observed American prisoners. On March 15, 1942, he noted, "The American prisoners continue to perplex me. Today I watched as they shared their rice portions with 3 men too sick to work. In the Imperial Army, such weakness would be met with discipline, yet these men show no shame in caring for those who cannot contribute. They maintain what they call unit cohesion through methods I do not understand. They argue among themselves freely, yet when threatened they unite as one. This is not the behavior we were told to expect from individualistic Americans." The symbol that would come to represent this unexpected American resilience was something as simple as it was profound: the sharing of food. In Japanese military culture, food was distributed according to strict hierarchy and merit. Officers received better rations, and those who failed in their duties could expect reduced portions as punishment. The concept of sharing scarce resources with the weak or unsuccessful was antithetical to Japanese military values, which emphasized that strength must be rewarded and weakness eliminated for the good of the whole. Yet in camp after camp, Japanese guards and officers witnessed American prisoners doing exactly what their doctrine said was impossible. They created a system of mutual support that actually seemed to strengthen rather than weaken their collective will to survive. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated fighter aces, would encounter this phenomenon firsthand when he was assigned to inspect prison facilities in the Philippines in early 1942, expecting to find broken men whose morale had collapsed under the weight of defeat and captivity. He instead discovered something that challenged his understanding of military psychology. In his post-war memoir, he described watching a group of American airmen who had been shot down over Luzon organize themselves into what they called a chain of command that operated not through fear and rigid discipline, but through something they referred to as looking out for each other. When one pilot fell ill with dysentery, his squad mates voluntarily reduced their own food portions to ensure he received extra nutrition. When another showed signs of mental breakdown from the stress of captivity, the group rallied around him with a combination of gentle encouragement and firm expectation that he would recover his strength. This behavior baffled Japanese observers because it seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about the relationship between individual weakness and collective strength. In Japanese military philosophy, the strength of the unit came from the absolute subordination of individual needs to group requirements, enforced through rigid hierarchy and severe punishment for deviation. The idea that strength could emerge from voluntary cooperation among equals, or that caring for the weak could somehow strengthen rather than weaken the group, was foreign to their understanding of military effectiveness. Yet here they witnessed American prisoners maintaining high morale and organizational cohesion through methods that Japanese doctrine insisted should lead to chaos and collapse. The evidence of American resilience extended beyond mere survival tactics. Japanese officers began documenting instances of American prisoners maintaining military bearing and discipline despite the absence of their own officers. Enlisted men elected leaders from among their ranks and followed their guidance voluntarily. They maintained training routines, sharing knowledge and skills to keep their minds sharp and their bodies as strong as conditions allowed. They created educational programs, teaching each other everything from foreign languages to advanced mathematics, turning their imprisonment into a form of informal military academy. Most remarkably, from the Japanese perspective, they did all of this without the coercive mechanisms that Japanese military culture deemed essential for maintaining order and purpose. By mid-1942, reports from prison camps across the Japanese-occupied Pacific were painting a picture that military planners in Tokyo found increasingly difficult to reconcile with their strategic assumptions. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the architects of Japan's early Pacific strategy, received detailed reports from camp commanders describing American prisoners who, rather than becoming demoralized and broken, seemed to be using their captivity as an opportunity to prepare for eventual return to combat. They maintained physical fitness routines adapted to their limited space and resources. They practiced military procedures and tactical discussions. They even conducted mock battles using improvised materials, continuously refining their understanding of Japanese tactics and developing countermeasures. The Most disturbing reports for Japanese military leadership concerned what camp observers termed American abundance mentality. Even in conditions of severe deprivation, American prisoners seemed to operate from a fundamental assumption that resources, opportunities, and better conditions were not only possible but inevitable. This contrasted sharply with Japanese military culture, which emphasized acceptance of hardship and scarcity as natural conditions that built character and spiritual strength. American prisoners complained constantly about conditions, not in the broken voice of defeated men, but with the confidence of people who expected better and believed they deserved it. They improvised solutions to problems with creativity and optimism that suggested they had never truly accepted their situation as permanent. This abundance mentality manifested in ways that Japanese guards found both admirable and disturbing. American prisoners would fashion tools from scraps of metal, create games and entertainment from discarded materials, and maintain personal hygiene and appearance standards that seemed almost defiant under the circumstances. They hoarded small items not out of desperate need, but because they appeared to believe that such items would be useful in a future that included their freedom and return to better conditions. Japanese observers noted that this behavior seemed to stem from a deep cultural assumption that improvement and opportunity were natural rights rather than rare privileges to be earned through suffering and sacrifice. The psychological impact of these observations on Japanese military personnel was profound. Many had joined the imperial forces believing in the spiritual and cultural superiority of Japanese civilization over Western materialism and individualism. They had been taught that democracy made societies weak, that individual freedom undermined collective strength, and that American prosperity had made its people soft and incapable of the sacrifices necessary for serious warfare. The behavior of American prisoners challenged these beliefs at the most fundamental level, suggesting that democratic values might actually produce a different kind of strength, one that was more resilient and adaptable than Japanese military doctrine had anticipated. Captain Sonoda's diary entries from this period reveal the depth of his intellectual crisis. On June 22, 1942, he wrote, "I have been ordered to study American prisoner behavior to better understand enemy morale and predict their collapse. Instead, I find myself questioning our understanding of strength itself. These men have been defeated, captured, and deprived of everything we consider necessary for military effectiveness: rigid command structure, adequate supplies, clear hierarchy, and the fear of punishment for failure. Yet they maintain what can only be called fighting spirit through methods we have been taught are signs of weakness: cooperation without coercion, leadership without absolute authority, and hope without certainty. I begin to wonder if we have misunderstood something essential about the nature of the enemy we face. The symbolic power of shared food became even more pronounced as conditions in the camps worsened throughout 1942 and 1943. As Japanese supply lines became stretched thin and resources scarce, prison rations were reduced to near starvation levels. Japanese guards expected this to finally break American morale and produce the collapse that their doctrine predicted. Instead, they witnessed something that challenged their understanding of human nature itself. American prisoners, rather than turning on each other in desperate competition for scarce resources, seemed to intensify their cooperative behavior. They developed sophisticated systems for ensuring that the weakest members of their groups received adequate nutrition, even when this meant greater hardship for the stronger individuals. Japanese medical personnel attached to the camps documented this phenomenon with clinical fascination and growing unease. Dr. Hiroshi Yamazaki, a military physician assigned to monitor prisoner health at Cabanatuan in the Philippines, filed reports describing what he termed inverse resource allocation among American prisoners. Rather than following the natural law that the strong should claim the largest share of scarce resources, American prisoners had created what they called buddy systems that specifically directed extra food and care toward those least able to fend for themselves. Sick prisoners received larger portions. Wounded men were given priority for medical supplies that the Americans had managed to create or acquire through trading, and those showing signs of mental exhaustion were protected and supported by the group until they recovered. This behavior was particularly puzzling to Japanese observers because it seemed to violate basic principles of natural selection and military efficiency. In Japanese military culture, Resources were allocated according to rank, contribution, and potential value to the group's mission. Those who became liabilities through sickness, injury, or mental weakness could expect to be abandoned or eliminated for the good of the whole. The idea that a military unit would voluntarily handicap its strongest members to support its weakest seemed not only counterproductive, but almost suicidal from a survival perspective. Yet American prisoners pursuing this strategy seemed to maintain higher overall morale and better group cohesion than Japanese doctrine suggested was possible. By early 1943, the implications of these observations were becoming impossible for Japanese military leadership to ignore. Intelligence reports from across the Pacific Theater were describing American forces that seemed to be learning and adapting with frightening speed. Rather than being demoralized by early defeats, American units appeared to be using each engagement as a learning experience, rapidly developing new tactics and strategies that showed increasing sophistication and effectiveness. The same qualities that Japanese observers had noted in prison camps: flexibility, voluntary cooperation, creative problem-solving, and resilience in the face of hardship were manifesting on the battlefield as American forces began to turn the tide of the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had already provided evidence that American industrial capacity and technological innovation were more formidable than Japanese strategists had anticipated. But the reports from prison camps suggested something potentially more dangerous: that American military culture itself might be fundamentally more adaptive and resilient than Japanese doctrine had assumed. The individualistic tendencies that Japanese strategists had identified as weaknesses might actually be sources of strength in the kind of prolonged, complex warfare that the Pacific conflict was becoming. The ability to think independently, question authority constructively, and adapt quickly to changing circumstances were proving valuable in ways that rigid hierarchical structures might not be able to match. Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, the same pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, would later reflect on the evolution of his understanding of American capabilities. By 1943, he was no longer flying combat missions but serving in a staff capacity, analyzing intelligence reports and helping to plan defensive strategies as American forces began their island-hopping campaign toward Japan. In this role, he had access to detailed reports from prison camps as well as battlefield intelligence, and the picture that emerged challenged everything he had believed about the enemy he had faced on that triumphant morning at Pearl Harbor. The American prisoners, Fuchida realized, were not merely surviving their captivity, they were using it as a form of advanced military education. They studied their Japanese captors with the same systematic attention that they brought to everything else: learning language, customs, tactical preferences, and psychological patterns. They shared this intelligence among themselves, creating an informal but highly effective intelligence network that operated within the very heart of Japanese-controlled territory. Most significantly, they maintained communication with each other across different camps through elaborate systems of coded messages, smuggled notes, and shared information that demonstrated organizational capabilities that Japanese intelligence had not anticipated. The food sharing that had initially puzzled Japanese observers began to reveal itself as part of a larger, strategic philosophy that American prisoners had developed. They understood, perhaps better than their captors, that their ultimate value lay not in individual survival, but in collective knowledge and capability. By keeping as many men as possible alive and mentally sharp, they were preserving not just personnel but institutional memory, tactical experience, and morale that would prove valuable when they eventually returned to American forces. Every prisoner who survived represented not just a life saved, but intelligence preserved, skills maintained, and fighting spirit protected for future use. This realization was particularly disturbing to Japanese strategists because it suggested that American military culture was producing soldiers who could think strategically even in the most disadvantageous circumstances. Japanese military training emphasized absolute obedience, acceptance of fate, and spiritual preparation for death as the highest military virtues. American prisoners seemed to be operating from a completely different philosophical framework, one that assumed survival was not only possible but obligatory, that resistance was a duty rather than futile defiance, and that every action should be evaluated in terms of its contribution to eventual victory rather than immediate honor. The contrast became even more stark as the war progressed and American forces began liberating Japanese-held territory. When prison camps were overrun by advancing American troops, the liberated prisoners consistently demonstrated capabilities that astounded both their rescuers and their former captors. Despite years of harsh treatment and inadequate nutrition, many emerged with detailed intelligence about Japanese defenses, troop movements, and strategic plans that they had gathered through careful observation and systematic information sharing. They had maintained military bearing, command structures, and combat readiness to a degree that seemed impossible given their circumstances. The medical examinations of liberated prisoners revealed another dimension of American resilience that Japanese observers had failed to fully appreciate. Despite severe malnutrition and often brutal treatment, American prisoners showed remarkably low rates of psychological breakdown compared to what Japanese military medicine would have predicted. The mutual support systems they had developed, the maintenance of hope and purpose through shared goals and values, and their refusal to accept their situation as permanent, had provided psychological protection that formal military discipline alone might not have achieved. They had discovered, almost by accident, psychological warfare techniques that were more effective than anything in the Japanese military manual. Dr. Yamazaki, the Japanese physician who had studied American prisoner behavior, would later write that the most significant discovery of his wartime service was not medical, but philosophical. The Americans had demonstrated that strength could emerge from cooperation rather than coercion, that leadership could be effective without absolute authority, and that morale could be maintained through hope rather than fear. These insights challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and military effectiveness that had shaped Japanese strategic thinking for generations. They suggested that democratic values, rather than being military liabilities, might actually produce more resilient and adaptable fighting forces than authoritarian systems. The symbolic power of shared food evolved throughout the war from a puzzling behavioral anomaly to a representation of something much larger and more threatening to Japanese strategic assumptions. Food sharing represented a fundamentally different relationship between individual and collective welfare, one that assumed abundance rather than scarcity as the natural state of affairs, cooperation rather than competition as the default human behavior, and mutual support rather than hierarchical control as the most effective organizational principle. These assumptions, embodied in something as simple as dividing a small portion of rice among hungry men, represented a challenge to Japanese military philosophy that went far beyond tactical considerations. As Japanese pilots flew missions over American positions in 1943 and 1944, they began to encounter evidence of the same qualities they had observed in prison camps, manifesting on the battlefield. American formations showed flexibility and adaptability that allowed them to recover quickly from setbacks and exploit opportunities with speed and creativity. American logistics demonstrated the abundance mentality in action, with supply lines that seemed capable of delivering not just adequate equipment, but superior equipment in quantities that defied Japanese understanding of resource limitations. American tactical innovation showed the same collaborative problem-solving approach that had characterized prisoner behavior, with new techniques and strategies emerging rapidly from field experience and being shared quickly across units. The realization that democratic military culture might actually be more effective than authoritarian alternatives was particularly devastating. For Japanese pilots and officers who had built their identities around the superiority of Japanese spiritual, discipline, and warrior tradition, the code of Bushido, the emphasis on death before dishonor, the cultivation of absolute loyalty to the emperor, all of these had been presented not just as Japanese values but as universally superior military virtues that would inevitably triumph over Western materialism and individualism. The evidence from prison camps suggested that American individualism was producing different, but potentially more effective military virtues: adaptability, resilience, creative problem-solving, and voluntary cooperation that was more flexible and sustainable than coerced obedience. By 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific with increasing speed and effectiveness, The lessons from prison camps had become impossible to ignore. Japanese strategic planning began to incorporate recognition of American capabilities that earlier intelligence had missed or dismissed. The assumption that American forces would collapse under pressure gave way to planning for prolonged resistance from an enemy that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as the war continued. The belief that individual defeat would lead to collective demoralization was replaced by awareness that American military culture seemed capable of treating defeats as learning experiences that ultimately contributed to eventual victory. The transformation in Japanese understanding of their enemy was perhaps most clearly expressed in the changing tone of official communications and propaganda. Early war messages had emphasized American weakness, predicting quick collapse once the soft democratic society encountered the harsh realities of total war. By 1944, Japanese propaganda was increasingly focused on the need for absolute determination to resist an enemy whose strength and resilience had been seriously underestimated. The Americans were no longer described as weak and decadent, but as formidable adversaries whose different approach to warfare had proven surprisingly effective. Captain Sonoda's final diary entry, written in August 1945, just days before Japan's surrender, captured the profound psychological impact of this transformation. The Americans we captured in 1942 have taught us something we were not prepared to learn. We believed that strength came from rigid discipline, absolute hierarchy, and acceptance of sacrifice. They showed us that strength could also come from voluntary cooperation, shared leadership, and refusal to accept defeat as permanent. We thought their individualism made them weak, but it made them adaptable. We thought their democracy made them chaotic, but it made them resilient. We thought their abundance made them soft, but it made them generous in ways that strengthened rather than weakened their collective will. I fear we have been fighting not just an enemy with superior resources, but an enemy with a superior understanding of how to organize and motivate human beings for sustained conflict. The simple act of sharing food among prisoners had revealed something profound about the relationship between individual values and collective strength. In a culture built around scarcity and hierarchy, the Japanese military had developed systems that were highly effective for short, intense conflicts, where absolute obedience and willingness to sacrifice were paramount. But in the prolonged, complex warfare of the Pacific Theater, American values of abundance, cooperation, and individual dignity had produced military capabilities that were more sustainable and ultimately more effective. The prisoners who divided their meager rice rations among the weakest members of their groups were demonstrating principles that would eventually prove decisive in the larger war. As the war reached its conclusion, the implications of what Japanese observers had witnessed in prison camps extended far beyond military strategy. They had discovered that democratic values, rather than being luxuries that societies could afford only in peacetime, might actually be more effective than authoritarian alternatives even under the most extreme conditions. The Americans had shown that individual freedom and collective strength were not necessarily opposed to each other, that voluntary cooperation could be more powerful than coerced obedience, and that hope based on principles rather than fear based on punishment could sustain human effort through almost unimaginable hardship. The recurring image of shared food, that simple, daily act of dividing inadequate rations among hungry men, had become a symbol of everything that Japanese strategists had failed to understand about their enemy. It represented not weakness but strength, not chaos but order, not selfishness but a more sophisticated understanding of how individual welfare and collective success were interconnected. In choosing to strengthen their weakest members rather than abandon them, American prisoners had demonstrated values that would ultimately prove more militarily effective than the harsh disciplines that Japanese doctrine insisted were necessary for victory. The Japanese pilots, who had flown over Pearl Harbor with such confidence in December 1941, had learned something in prison camps that no intelligence briefing could have taught them. They had encountered an enemy whose strength came not from the rigid perfection of a sword, but from the flexible resilience of bamboo, capable of bending without breaking, of adapting without losing essential character, of maintaining hope without denying reality. The abundance that had made Americans seem soft had actually made them generous. and their generosity had made them strong in ways that scarcity-based cultures found difficult to comprehend or counter. In the end, the greatest victory achieved by American prisoners in Japanese camps was not escape or resistance, but education. They had taught their captors something profound about the relationship between human dignity and military effectiveness, about the power of voluntary cooperation compared to coerced obedience, and about the unexpected strength that could emerge from values based on abundance rather than scarcity. The food they shared represented more than nutrition. It was a daily demonstration of principles that would eventually reshape the world, proving that freedom and generosity were not luxuries to be abandoned in times of crisis, but sources of strength that could sustain human beings through the darkest trials, and ultimately lead them to victory over forces that mistook cruelty for strength and control for wisdom.